this video, we are going to describe the prescribed title number 1 of the November 2025 examination session. So if you look at this question here, the prescribed title number 1, it says that for historians and artists, do conventions limit or expand their ability to produce knowledge? We have to discuss this title with a reference to history and arts. Okay. So, this question asks you to explore how conventions impact knowledge production in history and the arts, right? So, in order to analyze this title, you have to understand the meaning of the conventions. Okay, so convention here can be mean something like established norms, or it can also be the rules that are set by the previous historians and artists, and also it can be methods that are have been used by the historians and arts for a while. Okay, and also another thing that you need to think about is whether these conventions limit or expand, or even both, um, their abilities to produce knowledge. So when you say they, their abilities, we're referring to historians and artists, right? So we need to think about whether conventions limit the historians and artists' ability to produce knowledge, or expand historians and artists' ability to produce knowledge, or uh, both, limit and expand the historians and artists' ability to produce knowledge. So in order to analyze this question, you need to think about the elements of the knowledge framework. For this question, you have to think about in terms of all four elements of the knowledge from framework, which are the scope, perspectives, method and tools, and ethics. So when you think about the scope of the scope portion of the knowledge framework, you need to think about what kind of knowledge is produced in history and arts. And when you think about the method and tools, you have to think about how is knowledge generated. So, for example, something like historical method or the artistic techniques. And if you think about the perspectives, okay, you have to think about how do different perspectives shape knowledge, right? In this element, you can also think about in terms of bias too. So when you think about the ethics element of the knowledge framework, you also need to think about the other ethical considerations related to conventions in history and the arts. So when you think about the examples for this prescribed title, make sure you think about these elements of the knowledge framework in order to choose your example, and also in order to analyze examples. Okay? Then let's talk about the introduction part of your TOK essay for this prescribed title. So you first have to start your introduction by writing the interesting things about the prescribed title question itself. Okay, it can be interesting quote, example, or paradox related to the conventions in history and arts. Okay, and also don't forget to define the key terms in the title. So what are conventions mean, right? I told you it can be the established norms, rules, or method, right? So you have to discuss what this convention means to you in your essay, okay? And how do they relate it to your knowledge production? And also, third point that you have to discuss in your introduction is thesis statement. You need to state whether conventions generally expand, limit, or both for historian and artists. You have to choose only one of it, right? You can choose expand as your thesis statement, or you can say limit as your thesis statement, or you can say it's both. Sometimes it expands, sometimes it limit. Okay, but make sure don't forget that your TOK essay is still argument essay, right? So you still arguing your thesis statement using the claim and the counterclaim. That's what you need to remember. And then next, you have to give the reader a roadmap. Clarify for the reader how you're going to explore the essay question. You know, by identifying whether it's expanding, limit, or both. You can do that with the thesis statement. And also briefly explain how you will analyze conventions in history and the arts. Okay, include the outline of the body paragraphs, but not in detail, right? So what I mean by roadmap here is that uh, it is a clear preview of your argument structure. That's what you need to remember. Okay, and that's what you need to present as the roadmap. Okay. Then now let's talk about the essay format in general. So with this essay, I'm going to ask you to follow the very basic TOK essay format. You start with the introduction and you present your first AOK, which is art, and you present your claim, counterclaim, and sub-conclusion. With the sub-conclusion, you have to restate that your thesis statement works, right? Or possible using these examples. And then you have to present your second AOK, which is history in this case. And then you're going to go with the claim, counterclaim again. You have to make your sub-conclusion for this AOK and then present your conclusion, right? So when you present your claim or counterclaim, your claim section, or it doesn't matter whether you have a claim section or counterclaim section, it always have to follow this format, right? You present your argument, which is the claim or the counterclaim, and then you present your example and analyze that example, right? That's how you present your claim or counterclaim. Okay. Okay, then let's talk about the AOK section, right? So first AOK section can be arts, right? AOK number one is our arts. And if I say my claim is conventions in the arts expand knowledge by providing structure and tradition, then my possible counterclaim can be conventions limit knowledge by restricting creativity and expression, right? So in this case, all examples that you are going to choose for your claim and the counterclaim should focus how conventions limit or expand the artist's ability, right? We are just talking about the arts in this type. So we just talking about the artist's ability. And therefore, for each piece of evidence, think about, what different types conventions limit or expand artist's ability to produce knowledge, right? If expand, think about how artistic conventions, something like scope and in terms of scope and method, create. Also think about how conventions serve as a foundation for innovation. Um, for example, you can talk about something like how the Renaissance use of the linear perspective can expand the artistic expression, right? If it's the limit, if the example is for limit, right? Then you can talk about how strict conventions, like in terms of the perspectives and bias, can stifle artistic freedom and originality. No, you can also think about how breaking conventions can lead to new artistic movements, right? So example can be, something like the rejection of the impressionism by the 19th century of the art establishment, how it has break the conventions, right? You can discuss something like that. And for the history, this is our AOK number two. If I say my claim is conventions in history expand knowledge by ensuring reliability and objectivity, and then my counterclaim can be conventions limit knowledge by reinforcing dominant narratives, right? And um, all examples should focus on knowledge itself, uh, not artistic, historical works, right? I made a typo there. So therefore, for each piece of evidence, think about, what different types of conventions limit or expand historians' ability to produce knowledge, right? If we expand how historical method in terms of scope and method help, right? Also think about how without conventions, historical knowledge would be unreliable or subjective. A possible example that you can use for this section is, how we use primary and secondary sources in historical research to ensure the accuracy, right? That can be a good example, right? If we are referring to limit, right? Think about how historical conventions in terms of the perspectives and bias can exclude marginalized voice, right? Also think about how while conventions provide structure, they can restrict diverse viewpoints and alternative interpretations, right? So in this case, possible example that you can use is Eurocentric historical perspectives in textbooks, right? Something like rewriting history for the political agendas, right? There's a also saying something like, the history is always written by the winners, right? So uh, think about the examples in that way. Okay, so let's talk about the conclusions. So your conclusion must include lesson, statement, position, or insight, right? Or you can include all four of them by analyzing the example of your choice. So this is more of the summary of the two sub-conclusion, the summary of the two sub-conclusion you had, but also including all these four. Okay, so first you must restate the thesis or central argument. Briefly summarize your main claim or point. So um, in this case, you can talk about conventions both expand and limit knowledge, or expand knowledge or limit knowledge production depending on context, right? And you also have to summarize the key findings, highlight the examples or ideas you have used to support your argument, but do so concisely. Um, and also you have to broaden the context. Okay, so restate the thesis, summarize key point, and also you have to broaden the context. This is optional, but if you include this, it's actually extra points. You can end by expanding the significance of your argument to a larger context, or offer a final thought that reinforces the relevance, right? So um, consider how conventions evolve in different disciplines, right? You can also, contact connect the context to the real world implications, and also end with a closing statement, right? uh, Finish with a powerful statement or reflection that leaves the reader thinking, right? Something like, how do we balance the need for the conventions with the need for the innovations, right? So something like thought-provoking questions. Like that's what you need to include as a final sentence. Then let's talk about the examples. For the arts, when you're researching for the evidence, think about the type of the conventions, right? In terms of the four elements of the knowledge framework, and then think about the examples that which reveal different types of conventions. So here I have four examples actually. So the first one is the use of the perspectives in Renaissance art. Like the Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. How it used the mathematical precision to enhance the realism, right? Or you can talk about the classical music and music theory, like something like Beethoven initially adhered to classical conventions before innovating within them, right? And then also you can discuss something like impressionist rejection by the art establishment, like Claude Monet and the other impressionists were initially rejected because they broke the conventions of the detailed realism, and the ban of the abstract art in totalitarian regimes. Okay, something like Picasso's Guernica, was considered a politically dangerous by the oppressive regimes, right? Those are the possible examples, but there are a lot more examples that you can use. So research about it, think about it, right? And for the history, uh, here I have three of them presented. So for the history, think about the use of the primary and secondary sources in historical research. You know, going to talk about the World War II. So the study of the World War II through the first-hand accounts, like the diaries like Anna Frank's and verified documents, has ensured accuracy in historical understanding, right? Something like concentration camp. So, some of you might think that World War, a lot of my colleagues going to use the examples from the World War II. Is it going to be lame? What I always said is that if you know the example, if you can analyze that example perfectly, then use that, right? Um, your classmates, your colleagues can just your students in other parts of the world can use that exactly same example as you, but how they are going to analyze that example is different from how you're going to do it. So don't worry about it. If you like the example, if you can analyze the example uh, strongly, then use it, right? So, and the second example that I thought about was the Eurocentric bias in traditional historiography. So, the great man theory of the history, right? Which focuses on the elite figures like Napoleon or Churchill, while neglecting the lords of the Roman indigenous peoples and the enslaved communities, right? And the manipulation of the historical records like censorship, propaganda, so the Soviet, something like Soviet Union under Stalin erased the Trotsky from the official history, right? Or the China's official narrative on Tiananmen Square omits the full extent of the student-led protest, right? So think about something like that, right? So don't just use the example that I presented here. Think about your own, and then think about whether you know the example very well, right? And think about how you're going to analyze your examples. Okay, so that's it for today. And I'm going to come back with the prompt number 2 title. Please subscribe my video and like them. It's going to be a big help for me to create the rest of the videos. Thank you.